Hey guys, it's Fitz from PrimalWoW, and today I'm going to be starting a new video series in which we take a look at the different class roles on PrimalWoW and do some class comparisons, see how they stack up against each other. So I think one of the most interesting things about PrimalWoW is that, while it's vanilla and capped at 60, we're working with a Wrath client. So the classes aren't always how they were in vanilla. Some things work, some things don't work as well, but the good news is that pretty much every spec, or at least every class, has a spec which works very well. And today we're going to be taking a look at what I probably know best here on PrimalWoW, and that's DPS class. So two caveats at the start is that these rankings are based on my perspective through observations and raids and in 5-mans, and seeing how a large number of people deal with certain classes. And the other caveat is that this is a PvE perspective. Certain classes are much better in PvP on this server than they are in PvE. Also, I think it's fairly difficult to rank classes or specs 1 through whatever, because any specific fight, any specific raid is going to be different. Certain classes do very well on certain fights, not as good in others. So rather than ranking these into 3 tiers by their ease of success, and by that I mean how easy is it for this spec to do good damage at low gear levels, high gear levels, is it really isolated to certain types of fights where it does well, and that sort of thing. How easy is it to gear up? So keep that in mind as I'm doing these. So starting with our top tier, these are classes which do well at high gear levels, starting gear levels. They scale well, usually they're easy to gear up, and usually it's fairly obvious how to gear them up. They work well in pretty much any situation you can put them in. And I think the biggest difference between the classes in this tier and the classes in the second 2 tiers is that they stack very well. Certain classes in a raid, you only really want 1 or 2 of them, whereas these classes, you can put 6 or 7 in a raid and it's not going to really hurt your raid. So I'll go over these quickly, but I would probably put Hunters first among equals here. They do good damage when they start, they scale up very well, they get their best in slot weapon fairly easily from Molten Core, whereas the other classes are not going to see that until probably Blackwing Lair. And right now Volley is pretty strong, they have good AE, they do good single target, their pet can do good damage. All 3 specs seem to be working well. I've seen people do very well with all 3 specs, and their tier 1 and tier 2 sets are good for them. So all in all, great class. So I've seen some people on this server talk negatively about rogue DPS. However, the highest DPS I've ever seen posted by a character on this server is by a rogue. It might be a gimmicky fight in Veilstress, but you know what? That's an important fight to have rogues for. They do really good single target damage. They might not have a lot of AE, but they make up for it. They also gear very easily. They can use a wide variety of weapons. They're not too isolated. They can drop their thread really easily. So all in all, great class to play. Good DPS. Warriors are a little bit more interesting. 2-hand Fury and Arms both do pretty well from the start as long as the character has a slow 2-hander. Dual Wield Fury requires a little bit more gear, specifically hit, and also requires some very specific weapons. They need a slow 1-hander to succeed, and there are only a few of those that really fit the bill well. However, there are a couple pieces of gear that they can get really easily if they have mining, and all in all, not too difficult to gear up. They do have a little bit of threat issues. They don't really have any way to dump threat, but however, they can usually take a couple hits, via armor and stamina, and really they make up for their issues. They can do really good damage, specifically on fights like Veilstress, where it's really important. You want some warriors, and all in all, great DPS class. Last but not least, Warlocks. Now, Warlocks are on this list compared to the other casters for a few reasons. One is they probably scale the best with spell power. They also do the best single target damage of all the casters, most likely, and they can AE compared to something like a Shadow Priest. They have unlimited mana, really an Affliction spec. Their pet is just an endless mana battery, and also in Affliction, their passive healing is enough to cover a lot of raid damage, and they can avoid certain or ignore certain mechanics that other caster classes have to be a little bit more careful of. Okay, on to tier 2 classes. Now, again, let me restate that these are still really good classes. They can do good DPS. However, all of them have some issue nagging at them that really prevents them from succeeding in all circumstances. Maybe a lot of fights might have a mechanic that really prevents them from doing well in it, and that might be common or it might be pretty rare for the fights. So these are classes that, while they all do good DPS and provide benefit to the raid, you're generally, at the end of the raid, not going to find them at the top of the meters. So if that's important to you, just be aware. So while it might be controversial to put mages here in Tier 2 as opposed to Tier 1 because they have the best AEs right now in the game and they provide a lot of convenience benefits to a raid, as well as intelligence buffs, they also have, at least in their beginning spec, fairly weak single target damage. The Frostbolt spam just doesn't really cut it single target, and right now a lot of the boss fights are single target fights that last a while. Now they can spec to fire to get better single target damage, however that requires really, as I understand it, decent crit rating and maybe some decent mana, or at least mana regen, before that starts to work. So don't let that dissuade you from playing the mage if you want to, just realize that a raid stacked with mages is probably not going to do the best single target damage. Balance Druids, at first glance, look like they would be at the top tier. They have damage over time, they have good nukes, they have AE, they scale with both spell power and crit very well. And although some Balance Druids can do really high DPS single target, a lot of times you see Balance Druids doing very subpar damage. I think partially this is a stat priority issue. I think maybe some people go for the crit too hard over spell power and hit, but right now they're missing a talent that would bring their Hurricane up to par with the other caster classes AEs, so on AE fights they tend to fall behind. They do bring great buffs to the raid, however all it takes is one boomkin to get the 5% crit for the raid, so once you get past one it's kind of wasted. In Shadow Priest, we've got a class that's stuck between Vanilla and Wrath. So right now they don't have Vampiric Touch, so they're not providing mana. They don't have Mind Seer, so they can't AE, but they also are not providing the buff on their target that increases shadow damage. So unlike Vanilla, they're not improving the Warlock's damage. That being said, they do really good single target damage, so they're worth having in a raid, and also their healing that they provide to the group is not bad if you've got them in a tank group. Their high DPS rotation will do really good single target damage, but it will put them out of mana very fast, so they need support from the raid. But unlike the other caster classes, they are only shadow damage, so if the mob is shadow resistant, they're sort of out of luck. I've put both Elemental and Enhancement Shamans in Tier 2, and they tend to do about similar damage. They also tend to play very similarly. They both get in melee range, they both do a lot of their damage from Magma Totem and Fire Nova. But because so much of their damage comes from spell power, I would probably give the edge to an Elemental. They also have the option to back out, do damage from range. The melee range can be risky for Elemental Shaman because a lot of times they have cloth gear, and even though they have good mana regen and mana reduction talents, they can run out of mana at high DPS AE rotations. Enhancement, though, is missing a lot of talents and abilities that they could really get benefit from. For example, they don't get the talent that gives them spell power from attack power, they don't get dual wield, they don't get lava lash, and so they do decent damage. However, they tend to run out of mana at the high DPS rotations very quickly because they have no way to generate mana on their own from attacks. They also have very limited gear choices right now, but they do give really good buffs to the raid. For example, they're the only source of 20% haste that is in the game right now, to my knowledge. With Tier 3 DPS classes, we're at the point where certainly people are able to succeed with these classes, but most players are not going to get to the point where they can do good damage to the raid. Ironically, both of these classes provide really good buffs to a raid, but really stacking past just one or two of them is going to hinder any raid. The biggest problem with feral DPS druids, and I want to emphasize DPS, not tanks, is that they're missing Mangle. So they're missing the buff that the spec pretty much relies on that improves their bleed damage, which is a large part of their damage, as well as their backstab damage. They also have no AE in cat form, so to do any sort of AEing, they pretty much have to get into bear form, and until they have a really nice DPS weapon, they may have to lean on some chance on hit. Another issue with feral DPS is that their gearing takes a lot of effort. Unlike a lot of other classes, their gear is going to be a combination of PvP gear, crafted gear, a lot of high-level raid gear. Some of it doesn't drop that commonly, so you'll probably have the hardest time gearing up of any of the DPS classes we've listed here today. All that being said, they do scale pretty well, so it's certainly not impossible for them to succeed. It's just be advised that it's going to take a lot of work on your part if you want to. And in last place we have Retribution Paladins. Right now, Retribution Paladins don't have access to Crusader Strike or Divine Storm, so in terms of melee damage they are completely reliant on auto attacks. Because of this, a lot of their damage is going to come from things like Exorcism and Consecrate, which scale very poorly with Strength. So as of right now, one of the best ways you can do damage as a Retribution Paladin is to gather spell power gear. Unfortunately, Shockadins also don't work because Holy Shock is tagged as a healing spell, so in raids it takes a lot of extra mana to cast no matter how you're using it. One Retribution Paladin will give 3% crit to all the other damage dealers in the raid, so it's possibly worth bringing one for. Past that, certainly not. We'll see if they do any better when Naxxramas comes around. So thanks for watching, and let me know if you think I got something wrong.